The bouquet hit the hospital floor before anyone could speak. White lilies scattered across the polished hallway, their petals skidding beneath the fluorescent lights like something fragile had just been crushed in public. Bang Chan's hand stayed frozen in midair, fingers still curled from where he had been holding them, while Felix's mother stood in front of his hospital door with her chest rising too fast and her eyes full of something far more dangerous than grief. "Leave," she said, her voice low and sharp enough to cut skin. "Leave before Felix wakes up." No one moved. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and wilted flowers, too cold, too bright, too clean for the kind of dread crawling beneath their skin. Somewhere behind the closed door, a monitor beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. Alive. Felix was alive. That was all they had known when Chan's phone rang an hour ago, and Hyunjin nearly dropped his glass hearing the words accident and hospital in the same breath. It was enough to send 8 boys running through rain-slick streets with their hearts lodged in their throats. Now they stood outside Felix's room like strangers. Chan looked at her first because he always did. Because when everything cracked open, he was the one expected to stay standing. "Mrs. Lee," he said carefully, voice rough from the sprint and the fear he still hadn't swallowed. "We just want to see him." Her gaze snapped to his face with such raw fury that even Lee No stopped breathing for half a second. She said not loud, not hysterical. That made it worse. Her voice was steady in the way only truly devastated people could be. "You've done enough." The words landed harder than any scream. Beside Chan, Hyunjin stiffened so abruptly his shoulder knocked into Seungmin's. Han's breath caught. Jeongin looked at the closed door as if staring hard enough might let him see through it. Changbin's jaw locked so tight a muscle fluttered there, once violently. Minyu's expression didn't change, but his fingers curled deeper into the sleeves of his hoodie. Hyunjin had stopped blinking altogether. Only Chan spoke. "What does that mean?" Felix's mother laughed then, but there was no humor in it. Just exhaustion sharpened into something cruel. "It means," she said, "my son is lying in that bed because no one around him noticed he was drowning." Tore through the hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A cart rattled somewhere in the distance. Rubber soles squeaked against tile. The world kept moving in small, indifferent sounds while 8 people stood motionless inside the wreckage of one sentence. Chan felt it first as confusion, then disbelief, then something colder. Felix drowning? No. Impossible. Felix laughed too loudly. Felix smiled too quickly. Felix was always sunlight, always warmth pressed into skin, always the first to ask if everyone had eaten and the last to admit he was tired. Felix carried stress like a private ritual, quietly, beautifully, invisibly. Chan knew that. He had always known that, but knowing Felix had shadows was not the same as understanding how deep they went. Mrs. Lee stepped closer, and Chan caught the scent of expensive perfume dragged thin over hospital air and old fear. "He asked for space," she said, each word clipped. "He told me he was tired. He told me he couldn't breathe. And then he got in that car." Her eyes moved across all of them one by one, not sparing anyone. "And still, every one of you let him go." Hyunjin made a sound then small, sharp, wounded. It was the first crack in the room. "That's not fair," he said, and his voice came out thinner than usual, all velvet stripped away. "We didn't know." Mrs. Lee turned to him with such naked anger it made even Hyunjin fall quiet. "You didn't know," she repeated. "Exactly." Hyunjin flinched like he'd been slapped. The truth of it settled into all of them in different ways. Han looked down first, eyes fixed on the lilies crushed under someone's shoe. His mind was already racing backward, pulling apart the last month in fragments. Felix canceling movie nights. Felix laughing and then drifting silent too quickly. Felix saying he was tired. Felix saying he was fine. Felix always saying he was fine. Seungmin remembered the coffee Felix left untouched in the studio 3 nights ago. Changbin remembered the half-finished verse Felix had stared at for 20 minutes without writing. Jeongin remembered Felix standing on the dorm balcony at 3 a.m., shoulders shaking once before he smiled and said the wind was just cold. Minyu remembered everything and said nothing. Chan remembered the text he never answered. "You awake? Sent at 2. 17 a.m. read at 6:42. Forgotten beneath meetings, rehearsals, schedules, exhaustion. His stomach turned so violently he thought he might be sick. Behind the hospital door, the monitor kept beeping. Alive, alive, and somehow farther from them than he had ever been. Mrs. Lee exhaled shakily, but when she spoke again her voice had gone eerily calm. "You do not get to stand here and look heartbroken now," she said. "Not when he begged for silence and all any of you gave him was more noise." Chan stared at her. The guilt arrived like impact, not loud. not dramatic. Just devastating in its precision, because she was wrong, and because she wasn't. They had loved Felix fiercely, desperately, like family, like breath. But love, Chan realized in the fluorescent quiet of that hallway, was not the same as noticing. Love did not always mean understanding the shape of someone's suffering. Sometimes it only meant being shocked when it finally collapsed in front of you. The door behind her opened. Everyone looked up so fast it was almost violent. A nurse stepped out, young and tense, eyes flicking between the rigid line of boys in the hallway and Felix's mother standing like a wall in front of them. "Mrs. Lee," she said gently. "He's waking up." Every muscle in Chan's body locked. Hyunjin inhaled so sharply it sounded painful. Han looked up. Jeongin took one step forward without meaning to. Felix's mother turned immediately, all her fury vanishing into something raw and terrified. For one split second, Chan saw not anger but fear, pure, primal fear, tear across her face before she pushed into the room. Then she stopped in the doorway and looked back, not at Chan, at all of them. At 8 boys standing under hospital lights with rain still drying on their sleeves and guilt climbing slowly into their throats. She said, quieter now, more dangerous somehow for it. "Before he sees you." Then she shut the door, not slammed, not violently, just firmly enough to make the sound final. The click of the latch echoed louder than it should have. No one spoke for a long time. The hallway stretched around them in sterile white silence. A nurse passed. Someone coughed in another room. The lilies on the floor had already begun to bruise brown at the edges. Chan stared at the closed door until the shape of it blurred. He didn't know what hurt more, that Felix was awake and they couldn't see him, or that some part of him was beginning to understand why. Hyunjin was the first to move. He bent down in silence and began picking up the crushed lilies one by one. No one helped him at first. Then Jeongin crouched beside him. Then Han. Then Changbin. Petal by petal, stem by stem, they gathered what had fallen apart in silence because no one knew what else to do. Minyu stood watch at the door. Sumin leaned against the wall and stared at the floor like if he looked up, he might break. Chan remained where he was, unmoving, Felix's unread text burning like a brand in the back of his mind. "You awake?" The question sat there now like a wound. He wondered how long Felix had stared at the typing screen before sending it. Wondered what he'd wanted to say if Chan had answered. Wondered if this night could have become something else. Inside the room, a shadow moved behind the frosted glass. Felix was awake. Only a door stood between them now. A door, and everything none of them had seen in time. Chan did not remember leaving the hospital. One moment he was standing beneath the fluorescent lights, watching Hyunjin's trembling hands gather broken lilies from the floor, and the next he was outside in the wet blue silence of dawn with rain collecting in the collar of his coat and the city beginning to wake around them as if nothing had happened. The hospital doors hissed shut behind them. No one looked back. They stood on the curb in a crooked line, shoulders damp, faces drained of color, the bouquet now reduced to bent stems and bruised petals clutched in Hyunjin's hand like evidence of a crime none of them fully understood. Across the street, a convenience store sign buzzed weakly in the early morning haze. A taxi rolled past. Somewhere above them, a siren wailed and faded. The world was moving. Felix had almost died, and the world was still moving. Chan dragged a hand over his face, rain and exhaustion cold against his skin. He had not slept. He could still hear the steady beep of Felix's monitor beneath everything, tucked under the hum of traffic and the pulse in his ears. Alive, 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 it should have been enough, it wasn't. No one said anything until Hyunjin laughed. It was a terrible sound, too sharp, too hollow. It cracked out of him without warning and vanished just as fast, leaving something uglier in its place. He stared at the crushed flowers in his hands as though he didn't recognize them. "She threw them away," he said. His voice was soft, but it cut through the silence harder than shouting. Han turned his head. Hyunjin swallowed, his throat moving once. "She threw them away like we were nothing." "No," Minyu said quietly. 6 heads turned. Minyu stood with his hands in his pockets, rain catching in his dark hair, expression unreadable in the washed-out dawn. His voice stayed level, almost calm, and somehow that made everyone listen harder. "She threw them away like she was scared." Chan looked at him. Minyu finally lifted his eyes toward the hospital windows, toward the floor Felix was sleeping on, and something old and sharp flickered behind his composure. "Angry people want someone to blame," he said. "Terrified people make sure no one gets close enough to make it worse." The words settled into them slowly. Sumin exhaled first, long and quiet. "She thinks we'll upset him." No, Chan said before he could stop himself. Everyone looked at him now. His voice came out raw. She thinks we already did. The truth of it pressed down over them like weather. No one argued, because no one could. The van ride back to the dorm was silent except for the windshield wipers and the occasional rattle of the road beneath them. No music, no phones, no one asleep. 8 bodies packed into familiar seats, all carrying the same unbearable thought in different shapes. Chan sat in front with his elbows on his knees and his phone clenched too tightly in one hand. He had opened Felix's messages 3 times. He had not answered any of them. Not because he didn't want to, because he no longer knew what he was allowed to say. The thread was a graveyard of ordinary things. You eating, come downstairs, I made tea. You still awake, a photo of the sky from the dorm balcony, dark and violet and empty. One voice memo, unopened. Chan stared at it until the screen dimmed. He didn't press play, not yet. In the back, Jeongin had his forehead against the window, eyes half-lidded, watching rain slide sideways across the glass. He had been the youngest when they met, all sharp angles and nervous smiles, and Felix had always known how to coax laughter out of him without trying too hard. Felix had a way of making silence feel safe. Now the silence was unbearable. He smiled yesterday. The words slipped out of Jeongin so quietly Chan almost missed them. No one interrupted. Jeongin kept his gaze on the rain. The practice room, he smiled. I asked if he was okay and he said he was just tired. His mouth tightened. I believed him. Han shut his eyes. The van smelled faintly of wet fabric and stale coffee and the metallic tang of guilt. It clung to all of them, thick and sour and impossible to ignore. We all did, Changbin muttered. It should have felt like comfort. It didn't. At the dorm, no one went to their rooms. They drifted into the living room as if pulled there by habit, wet shoes abandoned near the door, coats dropped over chairs, exhaustion hanging heavy in the dim morning light. The dorm was too warm after the hospital, too familiar. Felix's blanket was still thrown over one side of the couch. His headphones sat on the table beside an empty mug. A half-read book lay open on the armrest, spine bent, a receipt tucked between the pages as a bookmark, evidence of someone who had expected to come back. Hyunjin stopped at the sight of it and looked away too fast, and sat down first, elbows on his knees, hands over his face. Changbin paced once across the room, then again, then stopped by the kitchen counter and gripped it hard enough for his knuckles to pale. Seungmin leaned against the doorway, arms folded too tightly, jaw tense in that quiet way he got when anger and fear occupied the same space. Jeongin sat on the floor. Minyu remained standing. Chan crossed the room and picked up Felix's mug. The ceramic was cold. A thin stain of tea clung to the bottom. Something in his chest pulled so sharply he had to set it back down. He turned toward them, and for one suspended second no one looked like idols or performers or anything public at all. They looked exactly what they were, 8 exhausted boys in a room missing its center. Chan inhaled. Then he did what leaders did when no one else could. What did we miss? The question hit the room like shattered glass. Han lowered his hands first. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice hoarse. He stopped sleeping. Chan looked at him. Han stared at the floor. I heard him in the kitchen almost every night this month. 3, 4 in the morning, he'd just sit there, no lights on. I thought he was writing. Seungmin's face changed. He stopped eating after schedules, he said quietly. Said he ate outside. Let out a harsh breath. He wasn't finishing his verses. Hyunjin spoke without looking up. He cried in the shower. The room went still. Hyunjin's fingers tightened around the ruined bouquet. I heard him, he said, voice thin. Twice. No one moved. He turned the water on too loud. Shut his eyes. Minyu finally spoke. He started apologizing too much. Chan looked at him sharply. Minyu's expression remained unreadable, but his voice had gone flatter, colder, the way it did when emotion became too dangerous to touch directly. For everything. For being tired. For being late. For forgetting things he never used to forget. He paused. People only apologize like that when they think they're becoming difficult to love. Silence after that was unbearable. Chan felt it in his throat, in his ribs, in the sick, hollow space opening beneath every memory he'd trusted too easily. He thought of Felix smiling too fast, laughing too brightly, saying I'm fine with that soft warmth that made everyone stop asking. He thought of all the ways pain became invisible when carried beautifully. Then Seungmin straightened from the doorway. There's something else. Looked at him. Seungmin hesitated, and that alone was enough to tighten every nerve in Chan's body. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and held it up. I got this last night. The screen glowed in the dim room. A message from Felix. Sent 3 hours before the accident. Seungmin. Voice was very quiet when he read it. If something happens, don't let Chan blame himself. No one breathed. The room seemed to tilt. Chan stared at the screen and felt the blood drain from his face so fast it left him cold. Not fear, not panic, something worse. Because those were not the words of someone distracted, not the words of someone careless, not the words of someone simply tired. Those were the words of someone who had already been saying goodbye. No one spoke after that. The message stayed on Seungmin's screen, small and white and impossible to misunderstand, and the silence that followed was not the ordinary kind. It was the kind that pressed against skin. The kind that changed the shape of a room. Chan stared at the words until they blurred. If something happens, don't let Chan blame himself. There were too many things wrong with that sentence. Too much intention in it. Too much care. Felix had known enough to worry about what came after. He had looked ahead to damage and tried to soften it before anyone else saw it coming. That was the part that hurt most. Even in whatever dark place had taken him there, Felix had still been thinking about them. Chan took Seungmin's phone without realizing he was moving. His hand shook once, barely visible, but enough for Minyu to notice. Minyu noticed everything. "What time?" Chan asked. Seungmin swallowed. 11:14. The accident happened just after 3 hours. 3 hours between that message and the phone call that had split the night open. Chan looked up too fast, mind already moving somewhere dangerous. What did he do for 3 hours? No one answered, because all of them were asking themselves the same thing. The dorm had grown too quiet. Morning light leaked across the floorboards in pale strips, catching on Felix's abandoned headphones, the open book on the armrest, the tea stain in the bottom of his mug. Ordinary things had become unbearable to look at. Chan handed the phone back. "Call logs," he said. Seungmin blinked. "What?" "Check if he called anyone." Seungmin looked down, thumb already moving. The others gathered closer without speaking, drawn in by dread and momentum and the fragile hope that answers, however ugly, might still feel better than uncertainty. The room tightened around the glow of Seungmin's screen. One missed call to Chan. 2:17 a.m. Everyone's eyes lifted at once. Chan felt something in his chest twist so hard he nearly doubled over. The text, "You awake," and a missed call he had slept through. No one said anything. They didn't have to. Chan already looked wrecked enough. Seungmin kept scrolling, slower now. "No one else," he said quietly. Hand frowned. "That's it." Seungmin nodded. One call. One person, Chan. The weight of it settled like stone. Felix had reached for him last, not his mother. Not emergency services, not anyone else. Chan. The room felt suddenly airless. Chan turned away first. One hand braced against the kitchen counter, head bowed. He could hear his pulse in his ears. Too loud, too fast, drowning out everything else. One call, one chance missed. Behind him, no one moved to comfort him. Not because they didn't want to. Because guilt was too sacred, too sharp. Some pain had to finish cutting before anyone could touch it. It was Jeongin who broke the silence. "Play the voice message." Chan turned. Han looked up. Seungmin froze with the phone still in his hand. The unopened voice memo sat beneath the text thread like a live wire. 18 seconds, short enough to ruin everything. Chan stared at it. For one irrational second, he didn't want to hear it. As long as it remained unopened, some part of Felix still existed in uncertainty. Unfixed, unfinalized. The moment they played it, whatever waited inside would become real. Minyu saw it in his face. Chan. Just his name, quiet, steady, an anchor or a warning. Chan shut his eyes once, then nodded. Seungmin pressed play. Static crackled softly, a breath. Then Felix, not laughing, not smiling. Not performing warmth for anyone, just Felix, stripped down to something frighteningly human. "Hey," his voice was low, tired. Rough around the edges in a way none of them had heard often enough. There was a pause, and in it they could hear the faint hush of wind. He was outside, on the balcony maybe, or walking somewhere alone. Another breath. "I know it's late." A small exhale followed, not quite a laugh. "You're probably asleep." Chan's throat tightened so violently it hurt. Then Felix went quiet for 2 seconds too long, as if deciding how honest he was allowed to be. He began and stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I think I'm more tired than I know how to say." No one in the room moved. The refrigerator hummed. Rain ticked softly against the windows, and Felix's voice, gentle, exhausted, devastatingly calm, filled the space he had left behind. "I keep thinking if I rest for a day, maybe it'll stop feeling like this. But then I wake up and it's still there." A breath. "I don't know what it is exactly." Hyunjin's hand came up over his mouth. Han stared at the floor like he couldn't survive looking anywhere else. "I think," Felix said, quieter now, "I think I've gotten too good at pretending I'm okay." The words landed like impact. No one breathed because there it was, the thing none of them had named, not hidden, not even buried that deep. Just spoken too gently for anyone to hear the danger in it. There was another pause, longer this time. Wind brushed the mic, then almost too quietly. I didn't want to worry anyone. Chan felt his eyes burn. It would have been easier if Felix sounded broken. He didn't. He sounded apologetic. That was worse. I just needed. Felix stopped, exhaled shakily. I needed someone to notice without me having to say it. The room went completely still. Xiumin lowered the phone a fraction, as if the weight of it had changed. Chan could not feel his hands. No one looked at anyone else, because every person in that room had loved Felix, and every person in that room had missed him in exactly the way that mattered. The message ended with a small sound, fabric shifting, breath catching, and then Felix almost whispering, "Forget it. I'm just tired. Good night." The recording clicked off. Silence rushed back in, louder than before. No one moved. No one spoke. The room had become something fragile and unbearable, filled edge to edge with everything Felix had not said until it was almost too late. Chan stared at nothing. He could still hear it. I needed someone to notice. Not save me, not fix it. Just notice. Something in Hyunjin broke first. He turned away so fast he nearly stumbled, one hand over his face, shoulders folding inward as if he'd been hit somewhere no one could see. The sound he made was small and raw and immediately swallowed. Changbin swore under his breath and dragged both hands through his hair, packing once, twice, then stopping because there was nowhere in the room far enough to outrun what they had just heard. Han sat down harder than intended and pressed his palms into his eyes. Jiangin stared at the floor, unmoving, his face gone pale in that frighteningly blank way people looked when shock had not yet decided what form to take. Xiumin locked his phone and set it face down on the table like he could contain the damage by darkening the screen. Minyu remained still. But Chan knew him well enough to see it anyway, in the set of his jaw, in the rigid stillness of his shoulders, in the careful control that meant he was holding too much too tightly. Chan was the last to move. He sank into the nearest chair as if his body had finally remembered gravity. Then he laughed once. A broken, breathless sound. Not because anything was funny. Because if he didn't, he thought he might scream. He dragged both hands over his face and stayed there, bent forward, elbows on his knees, trying and failing to breathe around the shape of what Felix had left them. He needed someone to notice. Chan had spent years learning how to lead 7 other people through pressure, fear, exhaustion, cameras, schedules, expectation. He had learned how to read silence, how to spot strain, how to carry weight before it crushed someone smaller. And Felix had still slipped through his hands, not because Chan didn't love him, because Chan had mistaken brightness for safety. Minutes passed before anyone spoke. When Minyu finally did, his voice was very quiet. This wasn't sudden. Chan lifted his head. Minyu's gaze was fixed on Felix's empty mug. He didn't break last night, he said. He's been falling for weeks. The truth of it settled into all of them like ash, not one terrible night, not one accident, a slow collapse, invisible only because Felix had made it look graceful. Chan looked toward the window, toward the gray morning pressing itself awake beyond the glass, and for the first time since the hospital, something colder than guilt began to take shape beneath the grief. Not blame. Not yet. Suspicion, because people did not sound like that for no reason. People did not unravel that quietly without help. And suddenly Chan could not stop thinking about what Felix's mother had said in the hallway. He asked for space. He told me he couldn't breathe, then he got in that car. Chan straightened slowly. Something in his face changed enough for Xiumin to notice first. What? Chan looked at him, then at all of them. We've been asking the wrong question. Han frowned. What do you mean? Chan's voice came out low. We keep asking what we missed. Looked toward Felix's room, toward the empty spaces Felix had left behind, toward the silence that now felt less like absence and more like evidence. We should be asking what happened. No one argued with him, not because they agreed immediately, but because the question itself changed something in the room. What did we miss was grief. What happened was something else. It gave shape to the dread, direction to the guilt. It turned helplessness into motion, and motion, however fragile, was easier to survive than regret. Chan stood first. The chair scraped softly against the floor. His room. Hyunjin looked up, eyes still red. Chan, we're not invading his privacy, Chan said, though his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. We're trying to understand why he sounded like he was saying goodbye. No one challenged him after that. Felix's room was at the end of the hall, half open. still carrying the faint warmth of someone who had left in a hurry and expected to return. Chan pushed the door wider with more hesitation than force. The scent hit them first. Fabric softener. Tea leaves. The clean citrus Felix always wore, faded now into the cotton of his sheets, and the collar of the hoodie draped over his desk chair. It smelled so distinctly like him that Hans stopped in the doorway and shut his eyes. Felix was everywhere. His blanket lay folded too neatly across the bed, as if he had made it that morning out of habit. A pair of headphones rested on the pillow. His nightstand held lip balm, a half-empty bottle of water, and a tiny ceramic bowl filled with rings and loose guitar picks. The lamp beside it cast a warm pool of gold over the room, still switched on. He had left the light on. Something about that detail hollowed Chan out. Minyu moved first, slow and deliberate, gaze sweeping the room with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. He opened nothing at first, just looked. Desk, shelves, nightstand, bed, corners, the visible things people forgot to hide. Hyunjin stepped toward the bookshelf and froze. There were sticky notes tucked between pages. Not unusual. Felix marked everything, lyrics, thoughts, lines he liked, fragments of himself left in margins. But these were different, too many of them. Yellow tabs bloomed from the edges of books like warning flags. Hyunjin pulled one free. His face changed almost immediately. Chan crossed the room. What? Hyunjin handed it over without speaking. It was Felix's handwriting. Small, clean, familiar enough to hurt. How long can someone disappear before the people who love them notice they're gone? The room went still. Chan stared at the note until the words lost shape. Not dramatic, not poetic. Just honest enough to make his stomach turn. He checked the next one. Would they miss me, or just the version of me that makes things easier? Han made a sound under his breath. Jeongin had gone pale again. There were dozens of them, pressed into novels, wedged into journals, tucked beneath coasters, between lyric sheets, under the edge of his mirror. Not hidden exactly, just placed where no one would look unless they were already searching for damage. Changbin found one taped beneath Felix's desk lamp. Being loved is not the same as being seen. No one spoke after that. The room had become unbearable in a new way, less like grief now, more like trespass into something sacred and unraveling. It felt wrong to keep reading. It felt worse to stop. Seungmin moved to the desk. Felix's laptop sat closed beside a notebook and a stack of lyric pages clipped together too neatly. Seungmin hesitated only a second before opening the notebook first. The first pages were harmless, draft lyrics, melody notes. Scattered phrases in English and Korean. Half-finished verses scratched out and rewritten. A list of songs. A reminder to buy tea, then the handwriting changed, not the shape. The pressure. The pen had dug deeper into the page. There was no date at the top, just a sentence written so hard it had left an imprint on the paper beneath it. I don't think I'm scared of disappearing. I think I'm scared no one will notice until I start failing in public, and turned away. Seungmin kept reading, quieter now. I am so tired of being easy to love only when I am easy to carry. No one breathed. Page after page. It was all there. Not catastrophe. Accumulation. The private erosion of someone who had become too practiced at being gentle with everyone except himself. Felix had written about exhaustion like it was weather. About loneliness inside crowded rooms. About the strange humiliation of needing comfort and not knowing how to ask for it without sounding inconvenient. Chan took the notebook when Seungmin stopped. He read in silence. I keep performing, okay, so well that even I believe it until I'm alone. Another page. I think people can sense when sadness becomes inconvenient. Another. No one did anything wrong. That might be the worst part. Chan's hands tightened around the notebook. That line was more devastating than blame would have been, because blame could be fought. This was gentler. Truer. Harder to survive. Minyu had moved to the desk drawers. The first held cables, chargers, receipts. The second was clutter, pens, batteries, unopened mail. The third stuck halfway before sliding open. Inside was a prescription bottle. Everyone saw it at once. Chan's breath stalled. Minyu lifted it carefully. The label was turned outward. Escitalopram, prescribed 6 weeks ago. Hyunjin frowned. What is that? Seungmin answered first, too quickly. Antidepressants. The word landed heavy. Chan stared at the bottle in Minyu's hand and felt the room tilt all over again. 6 weeks. 6 weeks Felix had been trying to survive something none of them even knew had a name. 6 weeks of pills hidden in a drawer beneath cables and receipts and all the ordinary debris of being alive. Han looked sick. He saw someone. Minho set the bottle down with precise care. Jeonggin's voice came out small. Why didn't he tell us? No one answered immediately. Then Chan, still staring at the label, said what all of them were already beginning to understand. Because he thought needing help would become one more burden for us to carry. Silence that followed was absolute. Changbin dragged a hand down his face and looked toward the window like he needed distance from the walls. He was getting treatment, he said, more to himself than anyone else. He was trying. That hurt too. Maybe most of all, Felix had not been careless with his life. He had been trying quietly to keep it, trying to get better without frightening anyone, trying to heal without becoming difficult to hold. And somewhere inside that effort, something had still gone wrong. Minyu was still at the desk. He had not moved. His gaze had fixed on something half-hidden beneath the bottom drawer, a folded sheet of paper wedged so far back it had nearly escaped notice. He crouched, reached in, and pulled it free. A single page, printed, not handwritten. His expression changed in a way Chan had learned to fear, subtle but immediate. "What is it?" Seungmin asked. Minyu didn't answer at once. He was reading. Then his jaw tightened. Slowly, he held the page out. Chan took it. At the top was a clinic letterhead, below it, a date from 3 days ago, and beneath that, one line highlighted in yellow. Patient reports increased anxiety associated with repeated exposure to hostile online commentary and internal workplace stressors. Symptoms worsened following recent interpersonal conflict. Chan read it twice, then a third time. Hostile online commentary, internal workplace stressors, recent interpersonal conflict. The words sharpened the air. This was no longer just grief, no longer just a private collapse none of them had noticed in time. Something had pushed, something had worsened it. Something had happened 3 days ago. Chan lowered the paper slowly. No one spoke. Then Hyunjin, voice thin and suddenly cold, asked the question none of them wanted to hear answered. What interpersonal conflict?